Hi, today I will be teaching you how to properly take a patient's blood pressure. First, before we start, we need to make sure that the patient is sitting in the right position, which is with their back straight and their feet flat on the ground. And then we can ask them the 3 proper questions that we need to know before we take their blood pressure. So, have you had any caffeine in the last 30 minutes?
No.
And have you had any nicotine or tobacco products in the last 30 minutes?
No, I haven't.
And have you exercised in the last 30 minutes?
No, I haven't.
Okay, that's perfect. So now we can check to see if our blood pressure cuff is the right size for the patient. Here I have a regular adult size blood pressure cuff. And you want to make sure that the bladder, which is this half of the blood pressure cuff, is going to be around 80% of the patient's arm. And here you can see that it is around 80%, so this is a good size blood pressure cuff for the patient. When we are placing the cuff on the patient's arm, we need to make sure that the brachial artery is placed at the artery mark. And we also want to make sure that the cuff is around 2 fingers above the patient's elbow crease. When you're putting the cuff around the patient's arm, make sure it's not too tight where the patient is uncomfortable. You can check this by placing your finger underneath the cuff to make sure it's not too tight. If you could just hold this for me. And before we start taking the blood pressure, we need to take the patient's pulse of obliteration, and we can do that by first using our middle and index fingers and placing it following along their thumb to their radial artery until we feel their pulse, and you might need to use a little bit of pressure for this. And once I have felt her pulse, we can use the cuff to pump, we can use this bulb to pump up the cuff. First by tightening all the way to the right and pumping it up until I can no longer feel her pulse. So I stopped feeling my patient's pulse at around 120 millimeters mercury. So that means that is her pulse of obliteration. And when I'm actually taking her blood pressure, I will be pumping the cuff up to 20 to 30 more than the pulse of obliteration. So in this case, 140 to 150 millimeters mercury. And now we can use our stethoscope. When we use the stethoscope, make sure that the earpieces right here are pointing away from your face. And when we're using this hearing piece, hold the piece between your middle and index finger and make sure nothing is touching this part right here, because that can inaccurately measure the blood pressure. You want to place this piece right where the artery is and make sure that the tubes are not interfering with any sounds that you can hear. And make sure that you don't put this underneath the cuff, because that will bring inaccurate sounds as well. Again, tighten this, but right before you pump everything up, loosen it a little bit and retighten it so it's not too tight where you need to strain it a little when you're loosening it at the top of the pressure that you've pumped it up to. So now I'll be taking our patient's blood pressure. Okay. So my patient's blood pressure was 116/70. How I determined this was the first sound that I heard while releasing the pressure from the cuff was her systolic blood pressure, which was at 116 millimeters mercury, and the last sound I heard was at 70 millimeters mercury, which is the diastolic blood pressure. After you think you've heard the diastolic blood pressure, make sure you continue to release the pressure for 10 more millimeters of mercury so that you can be certain that the diastolic was actually the diastolic pressure that you heard. And while you are releasing the pressure from the cuff, as you're taking the blood pressure, make sure that you are releasing it at a constant rate of 2 to 3 millimeters mercury per second. And so while we are recording the blood pressure, make sure you write down the position the patient is in, as well as the arm that you use to take the blood pressure. So in this case, we would write down 116/70 millimeters mercury with the right arm and in the sitting position. And when you use this knob, I forgot to mention earlier, you want to turn it towards the right to tighten it and left to loosen it. Righty tighty, lefty loosey is an easy way to remember that. Okay, thank you very much for listening to my demonstration.